In this video, we'll have a brief look at the use of the client, or the HTTP client module. So what is an Angular module? So Angular apps are modular, and Angular has its own modularity system called ng modules. So ng modules are containers for a cohesive block of code dedicated to an application domain, a workflow, or a closely related set of capabilities. An ng model is a class marked by the ng modules decorator. So ng modules describe how the application parts fit together. So every application has at least one Angular module. This is the root module that you bootstrap to launch the application. So by default would be the app.module. So the ng module decorator has four components. The first is the declarations section. So it holds the application's components that belong to that particular module, whether they're the components, the directives, or pipes that you create. The imports, so the import modules, or it imports modules to include their functionality in your application. The providers array is the different services. It's basically where your data comes from. And the bootstrap section, so it's the root component that Angular creates and inserts into your index.html page. So to make a distinction here, difference between a JavaScript import and the ng module import section. So a JavaScript import, which is in the format of the import, the squiggly brackets from some particular place, is related to making your file available for the module. The Angular imports array in the ng module decorator tells the Angular app about the other modules that this app will require to work properly. So both linking the file and telling what modules are required is important. So there's a range of built-in Angular libraries that are already ng modules. We can see a range of them here, starting from animation and through to upgrade. The one we'll be looking at today will be one that's part of the common HTTP library. You'll notice that we also have another HTTP here, and we'll just talk about that in a minute. So the HTTP client module. So as of Angular 4.3, the HTTP client is now an evolution of the existing HTTP API, which we just saw in the previous slide. So both libraries exist in separate packages. One is in the common/HTTP and one is in HTTP. So to access the HTTP client in a module, we use a JavaScript import to import the file that we want to use. And we also add the HTTP client module to the imports array in the ng module decorator. In a component or a service, when you want to use it, we will import the HTTP client from the Angular/common/HTTP. And we'll also inject that HTTP client to the class via the constructor. So in our constructor, we will pass in a private, we'll create a variable name of type HTTP client. So then within that particular class, we can just reference to HTTP. So the HTTP client uses the XML HTTP request browser object, originally created by Microsoft, I think, back for IE5, to perform the HTTP requests. So there's the GET, POST, which are the two most common ones you've probably heard of, but also a PUT, PATCH, HEAD, and JSON-P. So the HTTP requests using the RxJS library are returned as observables. So what are observables? So an observable provides support for passing messages between publishers and subscriber. So a publisher could be a service that is available to be initiated to get some data from a database, and the subscriber could be triggered by the actions of a user on screen that then needs the data from the database to complete its display. So a subscriber receives notifications until the function completes or until they unsubscribed. Angular uses a third-party library called Reactive Extensions, the RxJS that I mentioned on the previous slide, to use observables. You may also see in some code online where they use a $ at the end of a variable name to designate that it's an observable. This is an arbitrary coding requirement, so it's up to you whether you want to use it. So to execute an observable that you have created and begin receiving notifications, you call its subscribe method, passing an observer. So the observer is a JavaScript object that defines the handlers for the notifications you're going to receive. So the subscribe call returns a subscription object that has an unsubscribe method, which you call to stop receiving notifications. So in this case here, once you have subscribed, the return of the actual subscription is a reference to the object, which we can then use to later unsubscribe. So in the case of something here, we've created a very simple observable. So an observables can be of many things. On this one, we're creating an observable of this list of numbers. So we can then subscribe to our list of numbers. And as we said here, an observer object defines the handlers for the notifications we're going to receive. So this here, this X and stuff, our next error and complete is the three objects or the three items that make up the observer object. And this is defined by the observer interface. And we'll look at interfaces in a moment. So the observer interface has three notification types. There's next, and this one is required that all subscribes will have a next. And this will handle each delivered value. We'll do something with it. We have two optional values of an error handler. So what will we do if our subscription returns an error? And what will we do if our subscription returns that it is now complete? So we have options for doing something with the value, with an error, or when we're complete. So the data published by an observable is known as a stream. This stream can be of any data type. So what comes back from our subscribe as our X can be of any data type. So HTTP client and interfaces. So HTTP operations performed by the HTTP client module return an RxJS observable of something that we can subscribe to. These observables emit a single value and then complete, never to emit again. So we can define what the something is by using an interface. So without this, you may get errors that the value does not exist on the returned object. So if in the case here, we were doing a GET request, and we have here is a reference to the interface, where the interface is defined as an export interface user, where it might pass back something like a name as a string, an age as a number, or a password as a string. In a service, the interface is defined before the class definition, so that is after the imports, but before you put in your export class, whatever the name of your class is. So here we just have a bit more of a code example. So here is the code that would define a very, very simple service. In this case here, we can see we have imported our HTTP client from Angular Common HTTP. And you can see we have here an interface of a user that's going to have a username and a success, that if you have successfully logged in, that would come back as true. You haven't logged in properly, that would come back as false. And the values that come back that will be defined on your server, depending on the route, what you're going to send back from information from there. So then we have a look in our class for our authorization service. The constructor passes in the HTTP client. Then we have a method that we can call on this service where we will pass in a username and a password. And this will return back a HTTP post request. Remember that these HTTP posts return an observable. So this login function is going to return an observable, and it will be passing the username and password as parameters into this particular route, which will be on our server. On the component side, where we go to create our subscription to this observable in our service, we could use something like a this.auth service, which is the name of our service, .login, which is the method, and pass in the required username and password, .subscribe. So the subscribing will be subscribing to the observer that's returned from the post request. Then you can see here I'm using two of the methods of the observable. The first one here will be the next field, so what's going to happen next. So in this case, I'll set some session storage to store what the current username is, and I will then move on to the next page that we want to go to based on now that they are a logged in person. Or we can throw an error value and put a message out to say that there was an error.